Let's see the difference between B2 and C1 gapped text. And as I always say, there's no better way to explain the difference than with an example. This is an example of B2. And this is an example of C1. So as you can see visually, there's a great difference. Let's analyze first the B2. He saw a poster in a design competition in order to create a symbol that represented the recycled paper. He decided to give it a go. It didn't take him long, only a day or two. I realized that, what is that making reference? The short time it took seemed ridiculous for something. What he's talking about, the symbol he created of recycled paper that has been so successful. Afterwards, he makes reference why it only took a couple of days, because he had already had in mind arrows and angles, as he had already done one, but based on recycling wastewater. Sentences are less complex because the texts are written with simpler sentence structures, fewer subordinate clauses, and more familiar vocabulary. And there is more clear linking words. For example, we have but, that, something. Now let's compare it to C1. Here he is describing a wild cat that he saw in a painting. And immediately after, he makes reference to that description, saying it is the typical image. And instead of saying wild cat, he says beast, and then wild cat is said afterwards. After this, he compares the wild cat to the domestic cat, making reference that it's a bit more bigger. And then he continues with other physical differences between them, introducing it with the connector however, and again makes reference to the size, much larger, to the weight, to the fur, and to the tail. In B1, it connects sentences that are nearby. In C1, it connects paragraphs. So it is required the understanding of the whole paragraph. Therefore, what they do is that they use embedded clauses, making sentences longer and more complex. For example, let's turn this paragraph into a B2 level. It is a typical image, but it is false because the wild cat is bigger than the domestic cat. So we just have to learn not to take into account this embedded information that is not necessary for this exercise. In B2, as the sentences are less complex and there are more linking words, the distractors are more obvious. Contrary to C1, because they are more subtle and it is more difficult to notice at first, so you have to pay close attention to notice them and not be misled. Now let's focus on cohesion and coherence, or in other words, how sentences logically connect. In B2, they give us one idea at a time. So, for example, this sentence is making reference to his design that it only took a day or two and why. But in the B1, there's a deeper coherence because there's a logical flow of arguments. Let me explain it. In the text, there usually has multiple connected ideas, not one. Not about understanding one sentence, but how the different ideas are related to each other. For example, the description is making reference to this, and the comparison is making reference to this. And how do they relate to each other in this paragraph? Well, it's because is making a comparison because the typical image is false. That's why he compares them. Let's make reference to the pronoun references that we find in B2. They are personal, demonstrative, relative, possessive. For example, that is making reference to the time it took. However, in the C1, they're more abstract. Why? Because they do not make reference to something specific. Where you get the idea easily, but this it is making reference to a full description. About lexical links, B2 focuses on repeated words, synonyms, related ideas. For example, in B2, in this text, it says, it didn't take me long, only a day or two. So it's repeating the same idea. So only a day or two could be included in the gap, and therefore it would be, it didn't take me long to come up with my design, and that would be here, only a day or two, which seems ridiculous for something. So I've done it like that in order to set an example. I'm going to make reference, for example, with synonyms. I am going to take out design and I'm going to place it here. So it would be, it didn't take me long to come up with mine, only a day or two. I realize that seems ridiculous for a design that has been so successful. Be the synonym of symbol. Let's compare this to C1. The beast here is an implied connection because it's making reference to how it is depicted in this description as a wild animal. So let's do a brief review. C1 is not related to sentences, but to paragraphs with a lot of embedded information to make it more complex. Structures are not obvious, but subtle. In the paragraph, there's going to be several ideas that are connected, not just a single idea. The pronouns do not make reference to a simple idea, but to a complex idea, for example, a description. The lexical limbs, for example, are going to be implied, as in this case, the beast with the description given. Hope I've helped you to understand the main difference in the gap text between B2 and C1. And it's a matter of practice to do it correctly, because as I always say, is theory important? Of course it is, but practice is essential in order to make all the mistakes practicing so we don't make them during the official exam. Bye bye.